Welcome back to a new episode of Wheels of History. Before we tell you everything about today's protagonist, we invite you to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. For you, it's just a small gesture, but for us, it is essential to continue sharing the stories of men and machines that marked an era. Because machines like this vanish twice, first from the roads, then from memory. Tonight's creature is the Motom 48C. Not exactly a motorcycle, not exactly a bicycle either. More like a nervous mechanical animal dragged out of post-war Italy by exhausted engineers with grease under their fingernails and anxiety carved into their lungs. The trouble arrived in 1959, and like most trouble in Europe after the war, it came wrapped in paperwork, regulations, and the cold breath of governments trying desperately to impose order on societies still vibrating from bomb sirens and reconstruction cranes. Italy was changing at violent speed. Concrete highways sliced through farmland. Television antennas began growing from rooftops like metallic weeds. American music leaked from cafes. Steel mills roared through the night while entire generations tried to outrun poverty on two thin wheels and impossible optimism. Then came the new highway code, a bureaucratic earthquake. The lawmakers in Rome decided the nation's tiny motorized bicycles had become too fast, too ambiguous, too wild for a country pretending to modernize itself responsibly. Suddenly, every manufacturer in Italy found itself trapped between engineering and legislation, between speed and signatures, between the workshop and the ministry office. Most companies panicked. Motom adapted. And that adaptation became the most successful machine the company would ever produce. They called it the C code. A single hard letter, clinical, administrative, almost authoritarian. But beneath that sterile badge lived something deeply human and deeply Italian. Desperation disguised as ingenuity. The Motom 48C was not born inside some polished corporate design center filled with smiling executives and coffee machines. It came from factory floors soaked in oil and cigarette ash, from workshops where men who survived wartime shortages now fought against a different enemy entirely: bureaucracy. Because post-war Europe had discovered a new religion: regulation. And the little Motom suddenly found itself standing trial before it. The company had already changed direction back in 1957 when the second generation of Motom machines abandoned the old 18-inch wheels that still carried the skeletal DNA of pre-war bicycles. In their place came 16-inch wheels, tighter, more modern, more aggressive, less countryside, more asphalt, more aligned with the new Europe emerging beneath neon lights, rock and roll records, and the hypnotic glow of cinema screens, where men like James Dean and Marlon Brando transformed rebellion into mythology. But the 48C was not a revolution. It was survival refined into machinery. The new laws were merciless. Maximum output restricted to 1.5 horsepower. Top speed limited to 40 kilometers per hour. Numbers decided by officials who probably had never smelled hot engine oil at midnight beside a provincial racetrack, while young mechanics argued over carburetors and politics beneath flickering lamps. And yet the real transformation was psychological. The humble moped ceased being treated like a motorized bicycle. Legally, it drifted toward the territory of true motorcycles. Suddenly there were homologation requirements, chassis stampings, identification numbers punched directly into steel frames like prison serials. Workshops that once operated on instinct and improvisation now drowned beneath paperwork. Factories across Italy felt the pressure immediately. You could almost hear the mood changing inside those industrial buildings. The optimism of the economic boom colliding headfirst with the suffocating machinery of administration. Outside, the country danced through its miracle years. Fiat factories expanded endlessly. Young workers filled cafes after shifts. American jazz echoed through smoke-filled bars. Highways carried dreamers toward Milan, Turin, the coast, the future. Inside the factories, men stared at blueprints under harsh lamps and tried to make freedom comply with legislation. That was the world that created the Motom 48C. A machine born not from luxury, but from negotiation. Negotiation between speed and limitation. between youthful rebellion and governmental restraint, between the fantasy of movement and the reality of post-war Europe, trying to discipline itself after decades of chaos. And somehow, against all odds, the little machine developed a soul. Not the polished soul of modern marketing campaigns. Nothing clean, nothing synthetic. This thing felt alive in the ugly way industrial machinery sometimes does. Alive like a refinery at dawn. Alive like the smell of gasoline trapped inside a leather jacket. Alive like provincial race circuits where local heroes pushed tiny engines beyond reason, while spectators drank cheap wine and argued about politics, football, and American movies. The Motom was small, but it carried the tension of an entire era inside its frame. You could feel the shadow of the war still hanging over Europe. Factories rebuilt from rubble. Families still haunted by ration cards and missing fathers. Yet at the same time, the continent accelerated toward consumerism with terrifying hunger. Chrome expanded everywhere. Petrol stations multiplied beside fresh highways. Teenagers discovered speed, music, and mechanical identity all at once. Then came the oil anxieties, economic uncertainty, social unrest, youth rebellion. And through it all, these tiny machines kept buzzing through narrow streets and industrial suburbs like determined insects carrying the exhausted dreams of the working class. The Motom 48C never demanded glory. It demanded motion. It belonged to mechanics with scarred hands, factory workers chasing distance after 12-hour shifts, young men with empty pockets and impossible ambitions. It belonged to an Italy caught somewhere between peasant memory and industrial hallucination. And maybe that is why the machine still matters now. Because it does not feel like a product. It feels like evidence. Evidence of a century addicted to speed even while drowning in rules. Evidence of engineers trying to build freedom with limited materials and collapsing budgets. Evidence that sometimes the smallest motorcycles carry the heaviest history. A thin little engine, 1.5 horsepower, 40 kilometers per hour. And somehow, inside that fragile mechanical heartbeat, lived the sound of an entire civilization accelerating toward the future with oil-stained hands and absolutely no idea how to stop. The state wanted order. Naturally, the mechanics answered with cunning. Before 1959, the registration papers carried only the engine number, a ridiculous system born from bureaucrats who clearly never spent a winter inside an Italian workshop. Engines blew apart constantly in those years. Pistons cracked, bearings surrendered. Entire power units were swapped beneath leaking lamps while rain hammered corrugated steel roofs and exhausted men argued over football scores and communist strikes. Post-war Italy survived by improvisation. A motorcycle engine was not sacred. It was temporary, disposable, a wounded soldier patched together and sent back into battle. So every time an owner replaced a damaged engine, the machine technically required a fresh homologation. More forms, more inspections, more waiting rooms smelling of wet coats and state anxiety. Unless, of course, somebody knew a mechanic willing to solve the problem in the traditional Italian way, quietly, creatively, and without attracting attention. Then the new highway code arrived and finally dragged the system into mechanical reality. The frame became the true identity of the vehicle. The stamped chassis number, first marked under the initials IGM, later transformed into DGM, now appeared directly on the registration documents alongside the frame itself. The engine was liberated from its bureaucratic chains. It could be replaced without reopening the gates of administrative purgatory every single time some overworked laborer cooked a piston while chasing trucks down provincial roads. And underneath all of this legal chaos, the little Motom engine quietly evolved into something extraordinary. The power unit inside the Motom 48 C represented the final flowering of an engine architecture, born back in 1947 with the original Motom mic, when Europe still smelled of rubble, ration cards, and military fuel depots abandoned by retreating armies. The dimensions remained faithful to tradition: 39 millimeters of bore and 40 millimeters of stroke. Numbers repeated with near religious devotion by generations of Milanese engineers who treated mechanical balance the way Renaissance sculptors treated marble. But internally, the engine matured. refine, tighten, perfected. The enlarged oil sump appeared first. Practical, unspectacular, absolutely essential. Then came the double-disc clutch, replacing the old single-disc arrangement like a tired factory boxer, finally receiving proper boots before one last championship fight. These were not cosmetic upgrades. They were evidence of a machine reaching adulthood after more than a decade of obsessive development. Motom also severed ties with the past in another crucial area: fuel delivery. For years, the company had relied on Weber carburetors, faithful companions from an earlier Italy of narrow roads and cautious optimism. But the 48C crossed into a new era with the Dell'Orto SH carburetor, first in the 14.9 configuration and later through the more refined 14.9.2 version. Tiny mechanical instruments built with the precision of surgical tools and the temperament of barroom gamblers. And then there was the suspended engine. Elastic mounting points connected the power unit to the frame, reducing vibration and extending durability in a country where roads often resembled artillery test grounds left over from the war. Italy in those years was still patching itself together. Fresh asphalt ended abruptly into broken surfaces. Industrial growth moved faster than infrastructure. Trucks overloaded with steel and bricks pounded the roads to pieces, while little motorcycles bounced through potholes carrying workers toward factories before sunrise. Comfort mattered, durability mattered more. Then came another strange little masterpiece of engineering paranoia: the automatic disengagement system for the freewheel mechanism, activated by rotating the handlebar control beyond third gear. A tiny detail, perhaps, but one that revealed the mentality inside Motom's engineering department. Men obsessed with mechanical elegance, even while governments strangled performance through legislation. Because by now, the lawmakers were everywhere. The lighting system became another casualty of regulation. High beam lamps were outlawed for mopeds under the new code, replaced instead by mandatory position lights, what nostalgic old riders would later call city lights. The old Bilux 15+15 watt bulb disappeared, sacrificed on the altar of safety and compliance. In its place arrived a weaker 15-watt lamp paired with a tiny 3-watt tubular bulb. Dimmer, tamer, safer. As if reducing illumination could somehow restrain the human appetite for speed. At the center of this regulatory storm sat Article 24 of the Highway Code, written with the cold precision of a military communique. Maximum displacement, 50 cubic centimeters. Maximum output, 1.5 horsepower. Maximum engine weight, 16 kilograms. Maximum speed on level ground, 40 kilometers per hour. A cage constructed from numbers. And the tragedy was that Motom's little 4-stroke engine had already evolved, far beyond those limitations. After a decade of relentless refinement, it comfortably produced more than 2 horsepower. An astonishing figure for such a tiny machine. The engineers in Milan had transformed the humble 48 cubic centimeter engine into a jewel of mechanical efficiency. Restricting it now felt like forcing a racehorse to pull delivery carts through traffic. For proud engineers, this was intolerable. So naturally they cheated, not crudely, elegantly. The solution emerged in the form of a patented device known simply as the regulator, a variable restriction mounted between the carburetor and the intake manifold. A beautifully sly piece of engineering theater. Through engine vacuum, a small internal slide gradually closed as revolutions increased, restricting airflow and reducing available power precisely enough to satisfy the authorities. Officially, the machine complied. Unofficially, everybody understood the game, because removing the regulator was laughably simple. Any reasonably curious owner with basic tools and enough recklessness could restore the engine to full strength within minutes. Suddenly, the restrained little commuter transformed back into the machine Motom's engineers truly intended. Sharp, lively, and eager to rev with the nervous energy of post-war Italy itself. And beneath this carefully staged deception, the engine continued receiving almost obsessive care. Lubrication became a science. The plunger oil pump grew substantially in capacity. The piston diameter increased from 5 mm to 7 mm. The single cam driving the pump gave way to a double cam arrangement, smoothing and doubling oil delivery like a transfusion system designed for endurance racing rather than humble urban transport. Even the external oil feed line to the cylinder head increased in diameter. Nothing was accidental. Excess oil drained back into the crankcase by gravity through additional return passages carved into the cylinder head itself, maintaining uninterrupted circulation through the valve train galleries, tiny hidden arteries feeding a mechanical organism that engineers treated less like a utility vehicle and more like a thoroughbred under constant medical supervision. Other improvements followed relentlessly. A needle spring appeared in the cylinder head to assist valve return. The clutch assembly became stronger, tougher, more resistant to abuse. Still dry running, still mechanically raw, but now operating with 2 discs instead of 1. Better grip, better reliability, better survival chances for riders who treated every provincial straight road like the final lap at Monza. And that was the contradiction at the heart of the Motom 48C. The government tried to create limitation. The engineers answered with refinement. The riders answered with rebellion. Somewhere between legality and mechanical obsession, this strange little machine became more than transportation. It became a portrait of an entire country balancing itself between discipline and instinct, while the 20th century roared forward in a cloud of smoke, factory dust, cheap fuel, and impossible ambition. And despite all the regulations, all the restrictions, all the ministry-approved attempts to domesticate it, the Motom 48C refused to betray its own nature. It remained stubbornly itself. A single-cylinder 4-stroke engine, 39 millimeters of bore, 40 millimeters of stroke, numbers small enough to sound harmless on paper, yet carrying the mechanical dignity of far larger machines. Because displacement alone never tells the full story. Not in Italy, not in an age when engineers squeezed miracles from tiny combustion chambers, while entire nations rebuilt themselves from war debt, labor strikes and industrial exhaustion. The cylinder and head were cast in lightweight alloy, not for luxury, but necessity. Weight mattered when every fraction of horsepower had to fight against legal limitations and bad roads. Above the piston sat overhead valves measuring 15 millimeters in diameter, operated through pushrods and rocker arms with the disciplined rhythm of precision clockwork built by men who likely slept less than they should have. The valve timing remained perfectly symmetrical, almost obsessive in its balance. The intake opened 16 degrees before top dead center and closed 44 degrees after bottom dead center. The exhaust opened 44 degrees before bottom dead center and closed 16 degrees after top dead center. Cold figures, perhaps. But underneath them lived movement, timing, breathing, mechanical respiration, the kind of engineering born before computers infected design offices. Back when timing diagrams were drafted by cigarette-smoking technicians leaning over stained paper, while outside the factory gates, the economic miracle screamed forward through traffic jams, political protests, and endless construction sites. Fuel delivery came through the Del Orto SH-1AR9 carburetor, later evolving into the sharper and more refined SH-1492 version. Tiny devices of brass, fuel, and controlled explosion. Delicate enough to demand precision, brutal enough to survive years of abuse from riders who treated maintenance schedules as vague philosophical suggestions. Ignition remained beautifully simple. A flywheel magneto handled both spark generation and electrical supply with the kind of rugged honesty modern machines abandoned decades ago. No electronic safety nets, no digital intervention. Just rotating mass, magnetic force, and combustion occurring thousands of times per minute beneath a fuel tank probably scratched by belt buckles and cigarette lighters. The crankshaft rotated on ball bearings. The connecting rod big end ran on needle rollers. And then there was the piston pin, perhaps the purest expression of Motom's engineering mentality. In the eternal pursuit of lightness, it was mounted directly into the small end of the connecting rod without bushings or bearing inserts. Minimalist, efficient, slightly insane. Exactly the way motorcycles used to be. Primary transmission came through gears, feeding a dry clutch that remained faithful to tradition long after easier solutions existed elsewhere. The 3-speed gearbox used constant mesh gears and was controlled through a rotating handlebar grip. an arrangement that now feels almost archaeological, like some mechanical artifact recovered from a forgotten racing paddock beside abandoned grandstands and rusting fuel drums. And in cable-operated versions, the freewheel disengagement activated automatically by twisting the control beyond third gear, simplifying engine starting in a way that felt almost suspiciously clever for such a modest machine. By 1960, the arrival of the Model D introduced further changes. The frame now consisted of two pressed steel shells joined along a vertical seam like the fuselage of some tiny industrial aircraft built for workers instead of pilots. It was practical engineering from a continent still haunted by wartime manufacturing logic. Build strong, build cheaply, build fast, keep moving. The suspension remained refreshingly free of vanity. Telescopic forks at the front, telescopic shock units at the rear. No chrome-covered fantasies, no luxury. Just enough suspension travel to survive the cratered roads of a rapidly industrializing nation, where overloaded trucks hammered asphalt into submission day after day. Then came 1961. More refinements, more adaptation, more evidence that Motom's engineers could never stop adjusting, improving, chasing mechanical perfection, even while the market slowly drifted toward louder, flashier, and simpler two-stroke machines. The 48 SS gained a steering column release for the left pedal. An additional mounting plate beneath the pedal assembly housed the brake light switch. Tiny modifications perhaps, but they reveal the constant pressure inside the company. Improve functionality, reduce costs, survive another year. And survival was becoming increasingly difficult. To save money, Motom replaced the lightweight alloy rear hub with a steel unit. Pragmatism defeating elegance. The sort of compromise that spreads through struggling industries during the later stages of economic optimism, when accountants begin quietly entering rooms once dominated entirely by engineers. Still, the machine retained its 105 by 20 mm drum brakes front and rear. Dependable, mechanical, and stubbornly old world. In 1960, the 48 C entered the market at 95,000 lire. A serious purchase for ordinary people. The sort of number discussed carefully at kitchen tables while radios played Adriano Celentano songs and fathers calculated overtime hours beneath yellow apartment lighting. Yet remarkably, the price barely changed throughout an entire decade of production. By the end of 1966, it reached 122,000 lire. By 1969, examples could still be found for under 100,000 lire. A machine surviving against inflation, competition, and cultural transformation. Because the world around the Motom was changing violently now. The 1960s accelerated everything. Music became louder. Youth became restless. Cinema turned cynical. Protest movements spread through universities and factories alike. Tiny, practical four-stroke motorcycles suddenly looked old beside the rise of aggressive sport mopeds and screaming two-strokes carrying the soundtrack of rebellion through European streets. Then, in 1965, the regulations softened. The pedals disappeared. That single detail said everything about the era. The fantasy of the motorized bicycle was finally collapsing. Europe no longer wanted practical hybrids. It wanted real motorcycles, real speed, real identity. So the 48 C evolved once more. Fixed footrests replaced the pedal system. A Kickstarter appeared. The famous Kickstarter, a simple steel lever carrying decades of motorcycle ritual inside one brutal downward motion. The rear brake moved to foot operation. The handlebars became wider and taller, finally acknowledging that riders themselves had changed. The generation born after the war was physically larger, culturally louder, and psychologically farther removed from the deprivation that created the original Motom machines. But by then, the tide had already shifted. Despite every refinement, every clever solution, every beautifully engineered detail, the 48 C could not fully reclaim the market. The world had become impatient. Cheap speed seduced younger riders. Simplicity lost ground to spectacle. Production finally ended in 1970, and with it, disappeared one of the last great survivors of Italy's post-war mechanical philosophy. Small displacement, maximum intelligence, relentless refinement. Yet before fading away, the little Motom achieved something remarkable. nearly 200,000 units sold. An astonishing number for a machine that never relied on glamour, never chased fashion, and never abandoned its mechanical integrity simply to satisfy trends. Because the 48C was never truly about speed. It was about endurance, about a wounded industrial nation teaching itself how to move again after catastrophe, about engineers trying to preserve elegance inside limitation, about ordinary people discovering freedom not through excess, but through motion itself. A tiny 4-stroke engine, 3 gears, 1.5 horsepower on paper, far more spirit underneath. And somewhere out there tonight, beneath flickering garage lights and the smell of old fuel, one of them is probably still alive, ticking softly as cooling metal contracts in the dark, like the heartbeat of the 20th century refusing to disappear. We'll stop here. And as always, we remind you that engine spare parts and rubber components for vintage motorcycles can be found on the website, thekingofpiston.com. Wheels keep turning, stories remain. Every motorcycle tells a journey and reveals an era. Until the next stop, always on 2 wheels, and always with a piece of history to tell.